An incredibly sad time for staff at the United Nations. Just take us through, from a global perspective, how the news of Kofi Annan's passing has been received.
I think in the words, Shante, of the Deputy Secretary General in that interview with SABC News earlier, Amina Mohammed, really talking about what a surreal moment this is to talk about Kofi Annan in the past tense, if you will, using the word was rather than is. And I think that is a sentiment that is essentially shared by a number of staff members here. You know, I spoke earlier today with Stefan Dujarric, the current spokesperson for the Secretary General, and he was quite emotional. He said, you know, Sherman, I'm very sad at this moment. I knew Kofi Annan well. I worked with him, and I owe my career to him. So I think really the current spokesperson for the Secretary General, Shante, encapsulating, I think, an emotion that many UN staff feel at this time. The UN Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, releasing a statement earlier saying Kofi Annan was a guiding force for good. He is with profound sadness that he learned of his passing. In many ways, Kofi Annan was the United Nations. I think really speaking to, as was summarized in that piece beforehand, is how Kofi Annan became Secretary General after really working himself through the ranks of the organization from as early as 1962 as a lowly budget director for the World Health Organization, really working his way to the pinnacle, which is the Secretary General of the United Nations. A statement from Ambassador Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the United Nations. Kofi Annan devoted his life to making the world a more peaceful place through his compassion and dedication to service. He worked tirelessly to unite us and never stopped fighting for the dignity of every person. Further afield, Theresa May, the current UK Prime Minister, said Annan reformed the UN and made a huge contribution to making the world he had left in a better place than it was when he was born into. And I think you will continue to see global leaders react as they learn about this very sudden and unexpected passing of the seventh Secretary General of the United Nations.
Yeah, definitely. And specifically having a look at the reaction that has gotten not only on the African continent, but globally. It might be a bit early, but what are we expecting in terms of memorials and tributes in the name of Kofi Annan?
Well, I can tell you that the first type of memorial that we're already seeing here at UN headquarters and certainly at UN missions around the world, Shante, is that UN flags have been lowered to half-mast. They will fly at half-staff for the next 3 days in honor of the seventh Secretary General of the United Nations. The family in that statement, the family statement, and combined with the statement from the Annan Foundation, indicating that funeral arrangements will be announced in the coming days. Of course, as is tradition when former Secretaries General, certainly diplomats that have worked at the United Nations, heads of state, the United Nations General Assembly is expected, of course, to pay tribute. And one imagines that at some point the Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, would like to appear in front of some microphones and a camera and pay tribute to his predecessor. Remember, it was Kofi Annan that appointed Antonio Guterres High Commissioner for Refugees, a position he served in for 10 years. So he referred to him as a mentor and would often seek his counsel. So we expect to hear more from the Secretary General and various tributes at the United Nations in the days and weeks ahead.
You know, something noticeable about some of the tributes that have been pouring in for Mr. Kofi Annan were the descriptions of how much of a humanitarian person he was, his compassion that he had, and his humility. Just take us through from a personal front how Mr. Annan worked with the media, specifically foreign UN correspondents.
I mean, I think the best way to really describe who he was is how the Norwegian Nobel Committee summarized the reasoning for him being awarded, him and the United Nations being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 2001. Quote, Kofi Annan has devoted almost his entire working life to the United Nations. As Secretary General, he has been preeminent in bringing new life to the organization, while clearly underlining the UN's traditional responsibility for peace and security. He has also emphasized its obligations with regards to human rights. He has risen to such new challenges as HIV and AIDS and international terrorism and brought about more efficient utilization of the UN's modest resources in an organization that can hardly become more than its members permit. permit, he has made clear that sovereignty cannot be a shield behind which member states conceal their violations. So the question is how did the media get on? I think when you stand up for human rights, I think he was probably very popular amongst the UN press corps, of course predating my time here at the United Nations, but I know that there's some senior members of the International Press Corps that certainly look at him fondly. I remember one occasion, Shante, when the Syria crisis was unfolding, and Kofi Annan was appointed the first mediator to the current Syria crisis. And this is kind of where the Geneva principles were born out of in terms of the peace process that needs to unfold in Syria. Of course, that hasn't happened. But he was the first. He was the first person that Ban Ki-moon turned to in terms of playing a mediation role in the Syria conflict. Of course, he played mediation roles in post-Kenya electoral violence a few years ago. He has been a pivotal role in the transition to civilian rule in Nigeria. He has played mediation roles in Zimbabwe, and of course famously gave, I believe it was in 2007, delivered the annual Nelson Mandela lecture, so beating even the likes of Amina Mohammed and Barack Obama to that prestige. So certainly very, very much loved, and certainly a sentiment that you will hear among diplomats, among UN staff and journalists alike.
We definitely thank you very much for your time this evening. That was UN correspondent Bryce-Pease as the world reacts to the passing of the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan.